On 19 September 1991, two German hikers crossed a melting glacier above the Tisenjoch Pass on the border between Austria and Italy and saw something dark protruding from the ice. They thought, at first, that it was rubbish or perhaps a doll. It was a man. He had been there for 5,300 years. The ice that had entombed him had also preserved him with a completeness no excavation could have matched. His skin survived, his tattoos survived, the contents of his stomach survived, and on his feet, intact enough to be studied stitch by stitch, were his shoes. Researchers came to call him Ötzi, after the Ötztal Alps in which he was found. He had been roughly 45 years old, brown-eyed, gap-toothed, marked with tattoos that may have served a medicinal purpose. He had, it would later emerge from the arrow embedded beneath his shoulder, been killed, shot from behind, possibly while fleeing, possibly betrayed by someone he knew. But before any of that could be reconstructed, before the wound was even noticed, archaeologists looking at the body's clothing had already understood that they were looking at the oldest complete European outfit ever recovered. Among its pieces, the shoes drew the closest attention, because shoes are where engineering meets necessity, and necessity, on a mountain pass at high altitude in the late Copper Age, was unforgiving. The construction was not crude. Each shoe used bearskin for its sole and outer base, chosen for the toughness and water resistance bear hide offered against rock and snowmelt. Deerskin formed the upper panels, lighter and more flexible, shaped around the foot rather than forced onto it. Inside, a net woven from tree bark functioned as a kind of internal sock, holding in place the material that did the actual work of keeping a person alive at altitude. Loose grass, packed in around the foot as insulation, and, researchers came to suspect, replaced or topped up as Ötzi moved between valley and mountain, wet lowland and dry, frozen highland. The shoe was not one object. It was a system, a waterproof shell, a structural net, and a renewable insulating layer, built by someone who understood that cold and wet were different problems requiring different solutions, and who had access to the materials and the skill to solve both at once. For years after the discovery, this was largely description. Scholars could see what the shoes were made of. They could not yet be certain what the shoes did or how well they did it, not from looking, anyway. That work fell to Petr Hlavacek, a Czech academic and a specialist in calceology, the study of footwear, at Tomáš Bata University in Zlín. Hlavacek's sources were not chronicles or letters, but the recovered material itself, the surviving fragments of leather, hay, and netting, decomposed and compacted by 5 millennia under ice, alongside published findings from the conservators who had worked on the original. From this, he and his team built a faithful reconstruction, choosing tanning methods, pig liver and brain, rather than the vegetable fats that had proven impractical, that approximated what Copper Age technology could plausibly have produced. Whether Ötzi's people used precisely that method is not something Hlavacek could prove from leather alone. What he could test was whether the resulting shoe performed. So he wore them. In September of 2001, Hlavacek and a team of climbers took the replica shoes onto Mount Similaun, not far from where Ötzi himself had died, and walked 12 miles across the kind of terrain the original owner would have known: uneven ground, alpine cold, ice underfoot. The shoes did not blister their wearers. They distributed pressure evenly across the sole, kept feet dry in temperatures as low as -10 degrees Celsius, and gripped where modern boots might have slipped. Whether this proves the original design was used precisely as the reconstruction assumed, or only that one workable solution among several possible ones happens to perform well, is a question the experiment could not fully settle. A replica confirms that an interpretation works, not that it is the only one that could have. What the test did settle, more plainly, was an assumption many had carried into the discovery without examining it. That footwear this old must have been improvised, makeshift, a desperate wrapping of skin around foot. It was not. The stitching was deliberate. The choice of materials was deliberate. The combination of a tough outer layer with a soft, replaceable inner one solved a problem that anyone who has ever walked far in the wrong shoes will recognize immediately, even if they have never set foot above a tree line. Whoever made Ötzi's shoes and the structural complexity of the build led Hlavacek's team to conclude that specialist makers, something like the earliest cobblers, were already a fact of late Neolithic life, had already arrived at the same basic principle that shoemakers would spend the next 5,000 years refining: that the foot needs to be protected from the ground, and separately, that it needs to be protected from the cold, and that these are not the same task. Rome did not invent the idea of a standard shoe, but it was the first power to write one into law. In 31 BC, the same year Octavian's fleet broke Mark Antony's forces at Actium, an edict attributed to the Emperor Augustus specified how many hobnails a military sandal was required to contain. The garment in question was the caliga, an open-weave leather boot issued to the foot soldiers and auxiliaries of the Roman legions, and the edict's concern with something as small as a nail count reveals how thoroughly footwear had become a matter of imperial administration rather than personal choice. A soldier's shoes were no longer his own design. They were government property, built to specification, and subject to a standard precise enough to be enforced across an army spread from Britain to Syria. The caliga itself was built from 3 layers of leather: an upper, cut and shaped around the foot and laced up the front and ankle, a midsole stitched beneath it, and an outer sole driven through with iron hobnails, sometimes bronze, their points hammered flat against an inner layer so they would not work loose and pierce the wearer's foot. The open weave of the upper let air circulate around the foot during long marches, reducing the blistering and fungal rot that a fully enclosed boot might invite in the heat of a Mediterranean campaign. It was, by design, a summer shoe built for distance, engineered not for a single battle, but for the tens of miles a legion might cover in a day, week after week, on whatever ground the empire's expansion happened to demand. That demand was constant enough to require its own labor force. The scale of production needed to keep an army caligati, booted, on the march, implies that military forts maintained shoemakers as a dedicated, full-time occupation, men whose entire trade was the manufacture and repair of a single standardized object, produced and reissued across an army that might number in the tens of thousands at any one post. This was not artisanal work in the sense of a single craftsman serving a single wealthy patron. It was something closer to a supply chain, governed by specification, regulated by edict, and repeated at a scale no earlier shoemaking tradition had needed to sustain. The caliga's reputation, though, did not rest only on its engineering. Roman writers and contemporaries treated it as something closer to a symbol, synonymous with the ordinary infantryman, distinct from the more refined indoor shoes worn by Roman citizens at banquets and in civilian life, where sandals proper were never considered acceptable outdoor wear at all. To be caligatus was to be a common soldier, and the boot's hobnailed sole carried associations of discipline and uniformity that extended well past its practical function. It is this symbolic weight that explains one of the empire's strangest nicknames. Sometime around 14 or 15 AD, a boy of 2 or 3 years old was brought by his father, the general Germanicus, into the army camps along the Rhine. His mother, Agrippina, dressed him in a miniature soldier's uniform, small versions of the armor, and small versions of the caliga. The soldiers found this amusing enough to give the boy a nickname, Caligula, Little Boot. According to the historian Suetonius, writing decades after the fact, the boy grew up to despise the name, even as it followed him to the throne. Whether the troops intended the nickname as genuine affection toward a child they had adopted as something of a mascot, or as the kind of mockery soldiers direct at anything dressed above its station, is not something Suetonius's account settles, and historians remain divided over how much weight to place on a biography written so long after its subject's death, under emperors with their own reasons to blacken his memory. What is not in dispute is the boot itself, and what it meant, that even an emperor's most lasting nickname could be drawn from a piece of standard-issue army footwear, because that footwear was, by then, inseparable from what it meant to be Roman and armed. The Caliga's hobnails, durable as they were across rock, dirt, and packed earth roads, carried one well-documented weakness: smooth stone. The historian Josephus, recounting the Roman siege of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, describes a centurion named Julianus charging alone into a crowd of defenders inside the temple precinct, only to slip on its polished marble floor. He goes down hard, his armor crashing against the stone, and in that single unbalanced moment, the defenders who had been retreating turn back and close around him. It is a death decided less by the qualities of the men fighting than by the surface beneath their feet. A reminder that even the most carefully engineered military boot in the ancient world was built for dirt roads and mountain passes, and faltered on the one terrain its makers had never needed to consider: the smooth floor of a conquered city. The Roman fascination with footwear as a marker of standing, patricians in dyed and ornamented shoes, plebeians in plain rawhide, slaves typically denied shoes altogether, was never confined to questions of rank alone. Running alongside it, in nearly every ancient culture that left behind a written record, was a second and almost contradictory instinct: that there were certain places, certain moments, where the correct and necessary thing to do with a shoe was to take it off. The Book of Exodus preserves perhaps the oldest version of this idea to survive in something close to its original telling. Moses, encountering a voice from a burning bush on Mount Horeb, is told to remove his sandals, for the ground beneath him has become holy. The instruction does not explain itself, and does not need to. Across the traditions that inherited this story, the logic settled into something close to common sense. Ordinary footwear, having touched the dust and refuse of the everyday world, carries that world with it, and to walk into the presence of the sacred while still wearing it is to bring something unclean into a space that demands the opposite. The shoe, in this reading, is not neutral. It is a kind of accumulated record of where its wearer has already been, and certain thresholds require that record to be left behind. This same instinct surfaces with remarkable consistency across cultures with no direct contact with one another. In Hindu and Buddhist temple practice, footwear is removed before crossing into the sanctum, a custom understood partly as hygiene and partly as something closer to humility, the worshipper approaching the divine in the same unguarded condition in which they entered the world. In ancient Egypt, priests are recorded performing their most sacred rites with bare feet, the absence of any barrier between flesh and floor treated as a precondition for nearness to the gods. In Japan, the custom extends outward from the shrine into the home itself, the genkan, the entryway where shoes are shed, functioning as a kind of soft threshold between the outside world and an inner one understood to deserve cleaner treatment. The specific theology differs in each case: purity, energy, hygiene, respect, but the underlying gesture does not. Something is set down at the boundary, and what is set down is, almost without exception, the shoe. It would be a mistake to treat this as a uniformly soft or gentle tradition. In some contexts, the bare foot was demanded not as an act of reverence, but as an instrument of discipline. Spartan boys were required to go barefoot through much of their training, the absence of footwear treated not as deprivation, but as conditioning, a hardening of both body and will, indistinguishable, in the Spartan view, from the broader project of producing a soldier capable of enduring anything. The early Olympic Games, similarly, saw competitors race and wrestle unshod, the bare foot here carrying no theological weight at all, only the assumption that direct contact with the ground was simply how the body was meant to move when tested at its limit. Christianity inherited the older instinct and, in certain of its branches, formalized it into something closer to vocation. The mendicant orders that emerged across medieval Europe, the discalced Carmelites among the most visible, built the absence of footwear directly into their name and their discipline. Discalciation serving as a continuous, daily renunciation rather than a single threshold crossed and then forgotten. To go without shoes, for these orders, was not an occasional ritual gesture performed at a temple door. It was a permanent condition, a way of carrying the humility of bare feet through ordinary life rather than reserving it for sacred ground alone. The logic, even so, traced back to the same root, that the shoe represents comfort, status, and a kind of worldly self-sufficiency, and that setting it aside, whether for a moment at a threshold or for a lifetime under vows, signals the deliberate surrender of exactly those things. What stands out, looking across these traditions together, is how rarely going barefoot was treated as a neutral or default condition once footwear existed at all. Once shoes had become available, once a culture had crossed the threshold the earlier chapters of this history describe, from accidental survival to deliberate manufacture to imperial regulation, the bare foot stopped being simply what was left when nothing else was available. It became meaningful precisely because it was now a choice. A society with no shoes has no occasion to remove them. A society that has shoes and chooses to set them aside at a particular doorway is making a statement that depends entirely on the existence of the alternative it has just declined. The style emerged around 1340 in the Polish city of Krakow, and from there spread outward across the courts of Western Europe with a speed that outpaced almost any other fashion of the medieval period. The shoes were known by several names, depending on where they turned up. Poulaines in French usage, Krakows or Krakows in English, sometimes simply pikes, after the weapon their tapering shape resembled. What distinguished them was a toe extended dramatically beyond the natural line of the foot, sometimes by only a modest few inches, sometimes, on the most extravagant examples worn by the wealthiest lords, by something closer to 6 inches of pointed leather projecting out in front of the wearer with every step. The style reached England in earnest after the wedding of King Richard II to Anne of Bohemia in 1382, when Anne herself appeared in a pair, and what had been a continental curiosity became, almost overnight, the standard of fashionable dress at court. The engineering problem these shoes posed was not subtle. A toe that long, made from ordinary leather, could not hold its own shape. Left unsupported, it flopped, curled when wet, and lost the crisp silhouette that made the style desirable in the first place. Medieval shoemakers solved this the way shoemakers tend to solve such problems, with whatever material was at hand that could hold a shape without adding meaningful weight: moss, packed wool, or loose hair, stuffed into the tip to keep it rigid and upright. The solution worked well enough to let the fashion flourish for well over a century, but it did nothing to address the style's more fundamental flaw, which was that a shoe with several inches of leather extending past the toe is exceptionally difficult to walk in, let alone work, run, or fight in. This was, in a sense, the entire point. A poulaine announced, through its sheer impracticality, that its wearer did not need to do any of those things. It was a shoe built to be looked at rather than used, and the longer and more elaborately decorated the tip, the more clearly it stated that its owner's hands and feet were occupied with nothing more demanding than being admired. This is precisely what made the style a target. Long before any English statute addressed the matter, the Church had already taken notice. Pope Urban V attempted to ban the style outright in 1362, decades before it had even reached its full popularity in England, treating the shoe's exaggerated vanity as something closer to a moral failing than a fashion choice. The ban did little to slow the style's spread. and for the next century it continued to lengthen, peak, and circulate through the courts of France, Burgundy, and England, becoming, if anything, more extravagant the more it was condemned. Decorated in some cases with gold or silver thread, the most expensive versions, serving the same function silk and fine dye, had long served elsewhere. A visible, instantly legible signal of wealth that anyone on a street could read at a glance, without needing to know anything else about the person wearing it. It was this legibility that eventually drew the attention of lawmakers rather than clergy alone. Sumptuary law, the broad category of medieval and early modern regulation governing who was permitted to wear what, existed for exactly this reason: to keep the visible signals of rank from becoming detached from rank itself, to prevent a merchant's son from dressing in a way that could be mistaken, at a glance, for nobility. A toe length that any cobbler could produce for any customer willing to pay threatened to undo the entire visual hierarchy these laws existed to protect. Because unlike land or a hereditary title, a few extra inches of stuffed leather were available to anyone with the coin to commission them. The most explicit response came from England, in the form of a statute passed in 1463 under King Edward IV, restricting anyone below the rank of lord from wearing shoes or boots, with points extending more than 2 inches past the toe. The law did not merely set a limit, it built an enforcement structure around it, placing responsibility squarely on the trade that produced the shoes in the first place. 2 years later, in 1465, this was sharpened further. Cordwainers and cobblers operating within the City of London and its surrounding area were prohibited outright from making any shoe with a point longer than the permitted 2 inches, regardless of who had commissioned it or how much they were willing to pay. The regulation, in other words, did not rely on shaming the wearer. It worked upstream, at the level of the craftsman, making the act of production itself the point at which the law could be enforced, a far more reliable mechanism than attempting to police every lord's son strolling through a London street. This approach reflected something the Roman hobnail edict, more than 1,000 years earlier, had already demonstrated: that a system built to control footwear works best when it regulates the people who make the shoes rather than only the people who wear them. A cordwainer guild, organized, licensed, and accountable to civic authority, offered exactly the kind of choke point a sumptuary law needed: punish or restrict the maker, and the supply of the offending object dries up at its source, regardless of how many customers might still want it. The medieval guild system, already responsible for training apprentices, setting quality standards, and controlling who was permitted to practice the trade within a city's walls, became, almost incidentally, the enforcement arm of a law concerned with something that had nothing to do with the structural quality of a shoe and everything to do with what its shape was permitted to say about its wearer. The poulaine did not survive this pressure for long. Public moralists of the period had already taken to using the shoe as shorthand for vanity itself. A surviving morality play from around 1440 has the figure of pride advise mankind to blow mickle boasts with long krakows, treating the shoe's exaggerated point as a fitting symbol for exaggerated self-regard more broadly. Between the Church's earlier disapproval, the civic statutes restricting production, and a fashion cycle that had, by its nature, nowhere further to extend, the style fell out of favor by around 1475, giving way to a new silhouette entirely: broad, square-toed shoes, sometimes called duckbills, whose popularity is occasionally and perhaps unreliably traced to King Charles VIII of France and his own unusually wide foot. What the poulaine left behind was not a shoe, but a precedent. A clearly documented case of a government deciding that a piece of footwear had become consequential enough, as a marker of status that money alone could now purchase, to require formal legislation, formal enforcement, and a trade guild conscripted into policing its own members. The caliga had been a tool of empire, standardized by edict, because an army's survival depended on its boots, performing reliably across thousands of miles of frontier. The poulaine answered to no such necessity. It was regulated precisely because it served no necessity at all, because its only function was to say something about the body wearing it, and because that statement, once it became available to anyone with a coin and a willing cobbler, threatened to say the wrong thing to anyone watching. Between an empire's hobnail count and a kingdom's 2-inch limit lies the same recognition, arrived at twice, 14 centuries apart, that a shoe, however small an object it might seem, had become something worth the full machinery of the state to control.